welcome, dear listener, to a place where mysteries come alive. Here, we bring you timeless tales of clever detectives, hidden motives, and unexpected twists. Whether it's the daring charm of Tommy and Tuppence, or the keen intellect of Poirot, every story invites you to think, to feel, and to solve the case. Stay curious, and welcome to Guardian of the Night Stories. The Morning Post arrived at the Beresford residence with its usual punctuality, deposited through the brass letterbox with a satisfying clatter that echoed through the hallway. Tuppence Beresford, née Cowley, looked up from her marmalade toast with the expression of a hunter who'd just heard rustling in the undergrowth. "Tommy, darling," she said, her eyes gleaming with that particular light her husband had learned to regard with equal parts affection and apprehension. "Do stop reading the obituaries. Something far more interesting has arrived." Thomas Beresford lowered the Times with deliberate slowness, the gesture of a man who knew that breakfast piece, once interrupted by his wife's enthusiasm, was rarely recovered. "More interesting than the passing of Admiral Witherspoon? He lived to be 93, Tuppence. 93, and kept all his faculties to the end. How lovely for him," Tuppence said absently, already slitting open an envelope with a butter knife. "But this, my dear, is from Millicent Hartley. You remember Millicent? Vaguely. Red hair? Talked about horses. That's Pamela Rushworth. Millicent had the brown hair, and talked about absolutely everything else." Tuppence's eyes scanned the letter rapidly, her expression shifting from curiosity to intrigue to something approaching delight. Well, well, this is rather unexpected. Tommy set down his newspaper entirely, recognizing defeat. 23 years of marriage had taught him that resistance was not merely futile, but actively counterproductive. What does the estimable Millicent want? She's invited us to Marshwood Manor for a house party, a weekend gathering, some old school friends, a few neighbours, and... Tuppence paused dramatically. A surprise announcement. "How exhausting," Tommy murmured. "Can't people simply announce things in letters anymore? Must we travel to Sussex for the privilege of being surprised? Don't be such a bear, Tommy. Millicent married Charles Hartley, you know. Owns half of Marshwood Village and all the land around it. They've been living abroad for years, only just returned. This is their first proper entertainment since coming home." Tuppence's tone turned wheedling. "It might be rather fun. Country air, good food, and I haven't seen Millicent in ages." Tommy regarded his wife with the fond resignation of long practice. At 45, Tuppence retained the enthusiasm and curiosity that had characterized her youth, along with an unfortunate tendency to regard any deviation from routine as the beginning of an adventure. That these adventures had, on more than one occasion, involved actual danger seemed only to increase their appeal in her eyes. "When is this gathering?" he asked, surrendering to the inevitable. "Weekend after next. Perfect timing, really. Nothing much happening here, and the garden can spare us." She returned to the letter, frowning slightly. "Though there is something odd about the tone of this. Millicent sounds. I can't quite put my finger on it. Nervous? Excited? Perhaps both. Probably the strain of entertaining after so long away. Perhaps." But Tuppence's expression suggested she thought otherwise. She read a particular passage aloud. "Do come, Tuppence, darling. I find myself in need of someone sensible and discreet. You always were the cleverest of us, even if you did pretend otherwise. There are matters I should like to discuss with you privately. Now, what do you make of that? That Millicent Hartley has good judgment in friends, but questionable judgment in house party timing. If she has matters requiring discretion, a weekend gathering seems an odd venue. Unless," Tuppence said slowly, "the matters concern the other guests." Tommy sighed. Tuppence, my dear, delightful wife, light of my existence, you are not to go detecting at a social gathering. It's not done. I'm not going detecting, Tuppence protested, with an air of wounded innocence that fooled neither of them. I'm going to support an old friend who seems troubled. If interesting matters arise while I'm being supportive, well, that's hardly my fault. The last time you went being supportive to an old friend, we ended up exposing a blackmail ring and you nearly got pushed off a cliff. That was years ago, and the cliff was hardly very high. Besides, you saved me beautifully. She reached across the breakfast table to pat his hand. You always do. Tommy looked at his wife's eager face, at the sparkle of intelligence and mischief in her eyes, and felt the familiar mixture of exasperation and devotion that had sustained their partnership through war, peace, and numerous inadvisable investigations. Very well, he said. We'll go to Marshwood Manor, but Tuppence, promise me, no poking about in other people's business unless absolutely necessary. Cross my heart, Tuppence said solemnly. Then, after the briefest pause, she added, though what constitutes absolutely necessary is rather subjective, don't you think? Tommy picked up his newspaper again. I'm returning to the obituaries. They're far less alarming than you are. But as Tuppence rose from the table, already planning what to pack, Tommy found himself reading the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing a word. There had been something in Millicent Hartley's letter, in that brief passage Tuppence had read aloud, a note that struck him as not quite right. Tuppence, he called after her retreating figure. This surprise announcement Millicent mentions. Any hint what it might be? Her voice floated back from the hallway. Not a whisper, but she does mention that her stepson Geoffrey will be there, and Charles's business partner, and several old family friends who haven't all been together in 20 years. Rather a significant gathering, wouldn't you say? Significant, Tommy agreed quietly, or potentially volatile. That's the spirit. Tuppence's face reappeared around the doorframe, bright with anticipation. I knew you'd come around. It's going to be a perfectly lovely weekend, Tommy. What could possibly go wrong? Tommy returned to his newspaper without answering. In his experience, that particular question was usually answered far more thoroughly than anyone desired. Marshwood Manor rose from the Sussex countryside like something from a particularly romanticised painting, all honey-coloured stone and mullioned windows, with ivy climbing its walls in that artfully dishevelled way that spoke of careful gardening rather than neglect. The drive curved through parkland dotted with ancient oaks, and as their hired motor car crunched to a halt on the gravel sweep, Tuppence felt a flutter of genuine pleasure. Well, she said, gathering her handbag and gloves, I take back every grumpy thing I thought about coming. It's perfectly lovely. You didn't think any grumpy things? Tommy observed, climbing out and offering his hand to help her down. You were insufferably cheerful the entire journey. I thought them very quietly, where you couldn't hear. The front door opened before they could approach, and a tall, angular woman in an elegantly cut dove-grey dress emerged, arms outstretched. Tuppence! And Tommy! How absolutely wonderful! Millicent Hartley had changed less than Tuppence had feared, and more than she'd hoped. The brown hair was now threaded with silver, worn in a fashionable short style, and there were lines around her eyes that spoke of years lived under foreign suns. But her smile was warm and genuine, and the embrace she gave Tuppence held nothing of the artificial enthusiasm that marked so many reunions. You look marvellous, Tuppence said, and meant it, liar, but a kind one. Come in, come in. Charles is supervising something in the wine cellar. Men do insist on supervising when simple selection would suffice. But he'll join us for tea. You're the first to arrive, which is perfect. I wanted a quiet word before the others descend." They followed her through a beautifully proportioned entrance hall into a drawing room that managed to be both grand and comfortable, with French windows opening onto a terrace that overlooked formal gardens. Tea things were already arranged, and Millicent poured with the automatic grace of long practice. "Now then," she said, once they were all settled with cups and small sandwiches that Tommy eyed with approval, "I suppose I should explain my mysterious letter." "Only if you wish to," Tuppence said diplomatically, though her eyes were bright with curiosity. Millicent smiled. "Still the tactful one, Tuppence, but I know you too well. You've been dying of curiosity since you got it." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "The truth is, I'm worried. About several things, actually, but primarily about this weekend." "The announcement you mentioned?" Tommy prompted gently. "Yes. Charles and I have been abroad for 15 years. India mostly, with some time in Egypt. We've done rather well, financially speaking. Very well, in fact. And now we're home to stay. And Charles intends to make certain arrangements clear about the estate, about his will, about the business." She set down her teacup with a faint rattle. "I'm afraid not everyone will be pleased." Tuppence leaned forward. "The stepson you mentioned, Geoffrey Hartley, Charles's son from his first marriage. He's 32 now, and he's been expecting to inherit Marshwood and the bulk of Charles's fortune. But Charles has other ideas." Millicent's expression grew troubled. "Geoffrey has lived here while we've been away, managing the estate, or rather, mismanaging it. He's extravagant, unreliable, and has a positive genius for making poor investments. Charles has decided to leave the estate in trust, with Geoffrey receiving only an income from it. I can see how that might cause friction," Tommy said neutrally. "Friction?" Millicent laughed without humour. "More like an explosion, and that's not all. Charles's business partner, Ronald Stein, has been buying up shares in their company. Perfectly legitimate. But Charles has begun to suspect he's planning some sort of takeover. Then there's my own situation." She paused, her fingers twisting in her lap. "I'm significantly younger than Charles, 15 years, and I know what people think. Gold digger, fortune hunter, all the usual charming phrases. Anyone who spent 5 minutes with you would know better," Tuppence said firmly. "You're kind, but not everyone shares your generosity. Charles's sister Beatrice certainly doesn't. She'll be here this weekend, along with her son Harold, who's always resented that his uncle married again and provided potential competition for the inheritance. And then there's Dr. Lavington from the village. He's been our family physician for decades, and something of a confidant to Charles. And Clara Morton, who was governess here when Geoffrey was a child and has stayed on in a sort of companion role. She knows everyone's secrets, I think." Tommy absorbed this catalogue of potentially hostile guests with growing concern. "Millicent, forgive me for being blunt, but this doesn't sound like a house party so much as a powder keg. Why gather all these people together? Because Charles insists. He wants everything out in the open, he says. No whispers or insinuations after he's gone. He wants to make his intentions clear while he's here to explain them." Millicent's voice dropped. "The problem is Charles hasn't been well. Nothing acute, but Dr. Lavington has hinted that his heart isn't what it was. Charles knows it too, though he pretends otherwise. I think he wants to settle everything while he still can." "And you wanted us here because," Tuppence asked gently. Millicent met her eyes. "Because I'm frightened, Tuppence. There's something wrong. Something beyond the obvious tensions. I've felt it since we returned. Small things. A letter that went missing. A conversation I interrupted that stopped too abruptly. Looks exchanged between Geoffrey and Stein that I couldn't interpret. I may be imagining things, but—" She trailed off, then added firmly, "No, I'm not imagining things. Something is wrong, and I wanted someone here I could trust, someone clever and observant. You and Tommy have a reputation, you know, for seeing through mysteries." "We've stumbled through a few," Tommy said modestly. "You've solved several," Millicent corrected. "Will you help? Just by being here, by watching. I don't know what I'm afraid of exactly, but I'll feel safer knowing you're here." Tuppence and Tommy exchanged a glance, years of marriage allowing them to communicate without words. Tommy's slight nod was answer enough. "Of course we'll help," Tuppence said warmly, "though I hope you're worrying over nothing." "So do I," Millicent said, but her expression suggested she believed otherwise. The sound of a motor car on the gravel announced the arrival of more guests, and Millicent rose, her social mask sliding into place with practiced ease. But as she moved toward the door, she turned back for a moment. "One more thing," she said quietly. "Be careful around Geoffrey. He can be charming when he wishes, but there's something hard underneath. And don't trust Stein at all. I've never liked him, and Charles has begun to share my doubts." Then she was gone, leaving Tommy and Tuppence alone in the drawing room, with the remains of tea and a growing sense that their peaceful country weekend was likely to be anything but. "Well," Tuppence said, finishing her tea, "this is promising to be interesting." "That," Tommy replied, "is precisely what concerns me." Dinner that evening was a study in polite hostility, barely concealed beneath a veneer of social convention. Tuppence, seated between Harold Beatrice, a stolid young man with his mother's sharp eyes, and Dr. Lavington, a distinguished gentleman in his 60s with an air of quiet observation, found herself cataloguing the undercurrents with the attention of a naturalist watching predators circle prey. At the head of the table, Charles Hartley presided with the slightly forced joviality of a man determined to enjoy his own party, despite all evidence suggesting he shouldn't. He was a large man, ruddy-faced and white-haired, with a booming voice and a tendency to laugh just a bit too loudly at his own jokes. Tuppence, watching him, thought Millicent was right. There was something fragile about him, a hint of breathlessness when he moved, a pallor beneath the ruddy colour that spoke of a man whose heart might not be entirely reliable. Geoffrey Hartley, seated to his father's right, was a surprise. Tuppence had expected someone coarser, more obviously dissolute. Instead, Geoffrey was handsome in a sleek, almost feline way, with dark hair slicked back and an easy smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was charming to everyone, particularly to Tuppence, with a practised gallantry that set her teeth on edge. "Mrs. Beresford," he said during a lull in conversation, "Father tells me you and your husband have quite the reputation as amateur investigators. How thrilling! You must tell us about your adventures." "Oh, we're hardly investigators," Tuppence demurred. "We've simply had a knack for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or the right place at the right time, depending on one's perspective," Ronald Stein interjected from across the table. He was a thin, sharp-featured man, with calculating eyes, and a smile that suggested he was perpetually amused by a joke no one else was privy to. "I imagine there's quite a lucrative career in investigation these days, for those with the nerve for it." Tommy, seated next to Millicent, spoke up mildly. "We've never investigated for profit, if that's what you're suggesting." No, of course not," Stein said smoothly. "I meant no offence. Simply that one does hear such stories about private inquiry agents and the fees they command. But I'm sure your motivations are entirely pure." The barb was delicate but unmistakable, and Tuppence saw Millicent's hand tighten on her wineglass. Before she could respond, Beatrice Hartley, a formidable woman with iron-grey hair and a face that suggested she'd spent decades disapproving of things, spoke up from her position near Charles. "I'm sure the Beresfords are here as Millicent's guests and nothing more," she said, the emphasis on Millicent somehow making it sound vaguely unsavoury. "Though I must say, Charles, it is unusual to invite strangers to such a family gathering." "Strangers?" Millicent protested. "Tuppence and I have been friends for 20 years. "Yes, but you've been abroad for 15 of them, haven't you?" Beatrice said sweetly. "People change. Circumstances change." Her gaze swept over Tuppence and Tommy with cool assessment. One can't be too careful. An uncomfortable silence fell, broken by Dr. Lavington's gentle voice. "I'm sure we're all delighted to welcome new faces to Marshwood. The house has been rather quiet during Charles and Millicent's absence." "Too quiet," Clara Morton said unexpectedly. The former governess was a small, neat woman in her 50s, easy to overlook until she spoke, and then her voice carried a surprising authority. "Though perhaps that will change now that you're home to stay." Charles raised his glass. "Indeed it will. Which brings me to the reason I've gathered you all here." "Surely not over dinner, Charles," Millicent interrupted quickly. "I thought we'd agreed to wait until tomorrow evening." Charles looked surprised, then slightly sheepish. "Did we? Yes, I suppose we did. Tomorrow, then. A proper announcement with ceremony." He seemed to deflate slightly, and Tuppence noticed him reach absently for his chest before dropping his hand. The remainder of dinner passed with strained small talk, and when the ladies withdrew, leaving the men to their port and cigars, Tuppence found herself cornered by Beatrice in the drawing-room. "Tell me, Mrs. Beresford," the older woman said, her tone conversational but her eyes sharp. "What exactly did Millicent tell you about the situation here?" Tuppence kept her expression pleasant. "Situation? I'm not sure I follow. Don't be coy. She must have said something, to have you and your husband come all this way. Millicent has always been dramatic. It's one of her least endearing traits. I suppose she's been painting herself as some sort of victim." "She's been nothing but hospitable," Tuppence said carefully, "and I'm here because she's my friend." "How loyal," Beatrice said with a smile that held no warmth. "But do remember, Mrs. Beresford, that there are two sides to every story. Millicent is very good at presenting herself in the best light." Before Tuppence could respond, a commotion from the hallway interrupted them. Raised voices, Charles's boom and another man's sharp tones, and then the door burst open. "This is outrageous!" Geoffrey stood in the doorway, his face flushed. Behind him the other men filed in, looking uncomfortable. "I won't stand for it." "Geoffrey, please," Millicent began, but he cut her off. "No! If father wants to make announcements, let him make them now. Why wait? Let's have it all out in the open." Charles had followed more slowly, one hand pressed to his chest, his face alarmingly pale. Dr. Lavington was at his elbow, looking concerned. "Geoffrey, this is neither the time nor the place." "It's exactly the time and place," Geoffrey interrupted. "You're planning to cut me off, aren't you? After everything I've done, managing this estate while you've been living it up abroad." "You've nearly bankrupted it," Charles roared, finding his voice. "The accounts I've seen, gambling debts, foolish investments, money scattered about like confetti." "That's a lie." Geoffrey's hands clenched into fists. "Stein, tell him. The investments were sound." Ronald Stein had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Some investments involve risk, Charles. Geoffrey was attempting to increase the estate's income." "By risking what little remained," Charles shot back. "No, my decision is made. The announcement will come tomorrow as planned. But I'll tell you now, Geoffrey, you'll inherit an income, nothing more. The estate goes into trust." Geoffrey's face went from flushed to white, then to a mottled purple. "You can't do this. I can and I have. The will is already drawn up, witnessed and legal. You'll have enough to live comfortably, but you'll never control Marshwood. Because of her." Geoffrey's finger stabbed toward Millicent. "She's poisoned you against your own son." "That's quite enough," Tommy said quietly, stepping between them. His voice was mild, but his bearing military firm. "I suggest we all retire for the evening. Who asked you?" Geoffrey spat, but some of the fight had gone out of him. He looked around at the gathered company, seeking support and finding none. Even Beatrice, who clearly sympathized, looked away. "Tomorrow," Charles said heavily, his voice tired. "We'll discuss everything properly tomorrow. Now I'm going to bed." He moved toward the door, but halfway there he stumbled. Dr. Lavington caught him, lowering him gently into a chair. "Charles, your medication, do you have it with you?" "In my room," Charles gasped. "Just need a moment." Millicent was beside him instantly, her face frightened. "I'll get it." "No, I'll go," Clara Morton said, already moving. "I know where everything is kept." The room held its breath as Dr. Lavington loosened Charles's collar, murmuring calm instructions. Within minutes, Clara returned with a small bottle, and Charles swallowed the prescribed dose with water. Gradually, the colour returned to his face, his breathing steadied. "I'm fine," he insisted, though he let Millicent help him to his feet. "Just excitement. Tomorrow will be better, calmer. We'll talk reasonably." But as the party dispersed to their rooms, Tuppence caught Tommy's eye. Neither spoke, but they didn't need to. The house that had seemed merely tense over dinner now felt actively dangerous. In their room later, as Tuppence brushed her hair, Tommy stood at the window, looking out over the darkened gardens. "Well?" Tuppence asked. "Well," Tommy echoed, "I think Millicent was right to be frightened. That scene at dinner was more than family drama. There's real hatred there, Geoffrey." "Geoffrey, certainly, but not just him." "Did you notice Stein's face when Charles mentioned the will being drawn up and witnessed? He looked almost panicked for a moment. And Beatrice was far too quiet during the actual confrontation," Tuppence added. "She was needling us earlier, but when Geoffrey exploded, she said nothing at all." "Because she already knew," Tommy suggested. "Or because she's planning something." Tuppence set down her brush. "Tommy, do you think Charles is in actual danger?" "I think," Tommy said slowly, "that Charles Hartley is a wealthy man with a weak heart, surrounded by people who stand to gain from his death and lose from his living long enough to change his dispositions. Yes, Tuppence, I think he might be in danger. Then we need to watch him carefully." "We need to watch everyone carefully," Tommy corrected. "And Tuppence, no taking chances. If anything happens, we go to the police immediately." "Of course," Tuppence agreed. But as she climbed into bed, she found herself thinking about Millicent's frightened face, about the missing letter and interrupted conversations, about the small warning signs that added up to something wrong. Outside, an owl hooted in the darkness. Somewhere in the house, a door closed softly, and Tuppence, lying awake in the unfamiliar bed, wondered which of the guests was unable to sleep, and what plans they might be making in the quiet hours of the night. Morning brought sunshine, and the pretense of normalcy. At breakfast, served buffet-style in the cheerful morning room, the various guests maintained a careful politeness that fooled no one. Geoffrey was absent, as was Ronald Stein, both having elected to have trays sent to their rooms. Charles, looking better than he had the previous evening, but still fragile, ate lightly and spoke little. Tuppence, helping herself to scrambled eggs, found herself beside Clara Morton at the sideboard. "Poor Charles," the former governess said quietly. "Last night quite took it out of him. Is he often unwell?" Tuppence asked, keeping her tone casual. Clara glanced toward the table where Charles sat with Millicent, speaking in low tones, more so since returning from abroad. "The heat in India didn't suit him, I think. Dr. Lavington has been quite concerned." She paused, then added, "Though it's not just his health that troubles him. The situation with Geoffrey weighs on him terribly." "It must be difficult," Tuppence said sympathetically, "to see one's child go astray. Geoffrey's not a child anymore, though he behaves like one." Clara's voice was tart. "I had the raising of him after his mother died, and I'll tell you frankly, Mrs. Beresford, he was a difficult boy, and he's become a difficult man. Charming when it suits him, but selfish to the core." She seemed to catch herself. "But I shouldn't speak ill of the family. Discretion has always been my watchword." "Yet you've chosen to speak to me," Tuppence observed gently. Clara met her eyes. "Because Millicent trusts you, and because I think she's right to be worried. There are things happening in this house that aren't right, Mrs. Beresford. Letters going astray, conversations that stop when I enter a room, people meeting secretly in the gardens." She set down her plate with a decisive click. "I may be just an old governess kept on out of charity, but I have eyes and ears. Something is brewing, and it isn't good." Before Tuppence could press for more details, Harold approached, and Clara moved away with a slight nod. Harold, his mother's son in more than looks, had the same cool, assessing manner. "Mrs. Beresford," he said, "I wonder if I might have a word, perhaps a stroll in the garden." Tuppence agreed, curious about what Beatrice's son might want to say privately. They stepped out through the French windows onto the terrace, the morning sun warm on the flagstones. "I'll be direct," Harold said once they were out of earshot. "Mother doesn't want me speaking to you, but I believe you should know the truth about Millicent." "The truth?" Tuppence kept her voice neutral. "She's not what she seems. Oh, she plays the devoted wife beautifully. But before she married Uncle Charles, she was quite a different sort. There was a scandal in Cairo, something hushed up, but people talked. A man died, and Millicent was involved somehow. Uncle Charles never knew. She made sure of that. Tuppence studied him carefully. That's a serious accusation. Do you have proof?" "I have sources. People who knew her in Egypt. The man who died was wealthy, engaged to be married, and then suddenly dead in what they called an accident. A month later, Millicent married Uncle Charles." Harold's expression was earnest, almost sympathetic. "I tell you this not out of malice, but because you seem like a decent sort. You should know who you're defending." "And why?" Tuppence asked coolly. "Are you telling me this rather than your uncle?" Harold looked uncomfortable. "Because Uncle Charles wouldn't believe it. He's besotted with her. But you're objective. You can see what she really is." "What I see," Tuppence said pleasantly, "is that your mother stands to inherit quite substantially if Charles dies without Millicent in the picture. I also see that spreading rumours about a woman's past is a convenient way to undermine her position." She smiled at Harold's shocked expression. "Did you think I wouldn't work that out? You don't understand. I understand perfectly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I should rejoin the others." She left Harold standing on the terrace and returned to the morning room, her mind working rapidly. The attack on Millicent's character was predictable, but the specific detail about Cairo troubled her. Was there truth in it, or was it simply a convincing lie? Inside, she found Tommy in conversation with Dr. Lavington. The doctor was speaking quietly, his expression grave. "Simply can't continue this way. The stress alone could trigger another attack, possibly a fatal one. I've told him repeatedly that he needs rest and calm, not family dramatics. But he insists on making this announcement, Tommy said. He does. He's a stubborn man, always has been, and in a way I understand. He wants to settle affairs, while he can still make his wishes clear. But I fear this weekend may prove too much for him. Dr. Lavington sighed. I've increased his medication dosage, but there's only so much I can do if he insists on upsetting himself. Tuppence joined them, and Dr. Lavington excused himself to check on Charles. Once he was gone, Tuppence quickly related her conversation with Harold. Tommy frowned. Cairo? That's oddly specific. I thought so too. But Tommy, what if there's something to it? What if Millicent isn't quite what she appears? Then we'll discover the truth. But I'm not prepared to assume the worst based on whispers from people who have their own motives. He glanced around the room. Where has everyone gotten to? Indeed, the room had largely emptied. Charles and Millicent had retired to the library. Beatrice had gone upstairs, and the others had scattered to various corners of the house or grounds. I think, Tuppence said slowly, that this might be a good time for a bit of investigating. Tuppence, just a look around, Tommy. Nothing dramatic. But if Clara is right about secret meetings and missing letters, perhaps we should see what we can discover. They made their way casually through the house, ostensibly admiring the architecture and furnishings. The ground floor revealed nothing unusual. Formal rooms kept in beautiful order, a library lined with leather-bound books, a music room with a grand piano. Upstairs, the guest bedrooms were arranged along a long corridor. Their own room was at one end, Charles and Millicent's suite at the other. In between were the rooms assigned to the various guests. As they passed Geoffrey's door, raised voices stopped them. Absolutely not. Geoffrey's voice, angry and slightly slurred. Had he been drinking already? Be reasonable. That was Stein, his tone placating. If Charles has made up his mind, then we'll have to change it, or change the situation. A brief silence, then Stein again. That's dangerous talk, Geoffrey. You should be careful. I'm past being careful. This is my inheritance we're talking about. Footsteps approached the door. Tommy and Tuppence moved quickly and quietly down the corridor, slipping into an alcove just as Geoffrey's door opened. They watched as Stein emerged, looking troubled, and headed toward the stairs. Change the situation, Tuppence whispered. That sounds ominous. It sounds like the drink talking, Tommy said. But his expression was worried, though I don't like Stein encouraging him, then backing away from the implications. They continued their circuit of the upstairs, finding nothing more revealing until they reached the far end of the corridor, where a smaller staircase led to what had been the servants' quarters. Here, in a neat room overlooking the kitchen gardens, they found Clara Morton sitting at a small desk, writing. She looked up at their knock, unsurprised. Come in. I wondered when you'd find your way here. The room was simply furnished but comfortable, with a few personal touches, photographs on the dresser, a worn Bible on the nightstand, and Tuppence noticed a locked box on the shelf. You said this morning that things weren't right, Tuppence said. Can you be more specific? Clara set down her pen. I can show you instead. She rose and went to the shelf, taking down the locked box. From a chain around her neck, she produced a small key and opened it. Inside were letters, dozens of them, tied with ribbon. These, Clara said, are letters written by the late Mrs. Hartley, Charles's first wife, and Geoffrey's mother. She was my friend before she was my employer. When she knew she was dying, she asked me to keep these safe, to give them to Geoffrey only when he was mature enough to understand them. Have you given them to him? Tommy asked. No, because they revealed truths about his father, about Charles, that I don't think Geoffrey should know. Certainly not now, when he's already in such a state. Clara drew out one letter, its paper yellowed with age. This one is particularly relevant. Eleanor, Mrs. Hartley, wrote it just before she died. In it, she reveals that she knew Charles had a mistress before their marriage, a woman in London who bore him a child. Tuppence felt the puzzle pieces shifting. Another heir? Potentially. Eleanor never confronted Charles about it. She was too ill, and she loved him despite his faults. But she wanted Geoffrey to know, she said, so he could find his half-sibling if he chose. She gives a name and address, though of course both are 20 years out of date now. "Does Charles know you have these letters?" Tommy asked. "No, I've kept them hidden. But recently," Clara hesitated, "recently I felt that someone has been in my room. Small things moved. The box shifted slightly on the shelf. I don't think they found the letters. They would have taken them. But someone knows I have something worth searching for." "Who?" Tuppence asked urgently. "That's what I don't know. It could be Geoffrey, looking for anything that might help his case. It could be Stein, who makes it his business to know everyone's secrets. It could even be Millicent, worried about what Eleanor might have written about her husband." Clara replaced the letter carefully. "All I know is that I'm frightened. These letters are dynamite, Mrs. Beresford. If they came out now, with everything else—" "May I ask," Tommy said carefully, "why you're telling us this?" Clara smiled sadly. "Because you're the only people in this house I trust to do the right thing with the information. And because I think you need to know what you're dealing with. This isn't just about money or inheritance. This is about secrets that have festered for 20 years. About children who feel cheated and a man who may have more to answer for than anyone knows." They left her room shortly after, minds reeling. The case, for it was clearly a case now, despite their intentions, had become significantly more complex. "A secret heir," Tuppence murmured as they descended the stairs. "That changes everything, doesn't it? If the person still exists and can be found," Tommy agreed. "But Tuppence, Clara was right. That information is explosive. If Geoffrey learns of it, or if Stein does," Tuppence interrupted. "He's a business partner. He might see an advantage in finding this mysterious half-sibling and using them somehow." They had reached the ground floor when they heard shouting from the library. Charles's voice, raised in anger. And then Millicent, sharp and distressed. Tommy and Tuppence exchanged glances and hurried toward the commotion, reaching the library door just as it flew open. Millicent stood there, her face white, clutching a piece of paper. "Someone," she said, her voice shaking, "has sent Charles a poison pen letter. About me, about Cairo." Behind her, Charles sat slumped in his chair, the same dangerous pallor they'd seen the night before, creeping over his features. And Tuppence, taking the letter from Millicent's trembling hands, felt the case shift from concerning to actively dangerous, because the letter didn't just make vague accusations. It provided dates, names, and details that suggested the writer had actual knowledge of whatever had happened in Cairo. And someone in this house, someone among their small gathering, was determined to destroy Millicent Hartley's marriage, her reputation, and perhaps her life. Dr. Lavington, summoned hastily, insisted that Charles be taken to his room for rest. The excitement, combined with the shock of the poison pen letter, had brought on another of his episodes, though this time the medication worked more slowly, and the doctor's face remained grave, even after his patient's breathing had steadied. "This cannot continue," Lavington said firmly, addressing Millicent, Tommy and Tuppence in the hallway outside Charles's room. "One more shock like this could be fatal. I'm tempted to call for an ambulance and have him removed to hospital." "He won't go," Millicent said quietly. Her composure had returned, but her hands still trembled slightly. "You know how stubborn he is, Doctor. He'll insist on making his announcement tomorrow as planned." "Then he's a fool," Lavington said bluntly. "Forgive me, but someone needs to say it. His pride and stubbornness may kill him." After the doctor had returned to his patient, Millicent turned to Tommy and Tuppence. "The letter. You read it?" "I did," Tuppence said. "Millicent, is it true? What it said about Cairo?" Millicent's face hardened. "You want to hear the whole sordid story? Very well. Come to my sitting room. It's time I told someone the truth." They followed her to a small, elegantly furnished room, adjoining the master bedroom. Millicent closed the door carefully, checked that the connecting door to Charles's room was also closed, and then sank into a chair. His name was Peter Willoughby. She began without preamble. He was a diplomat, charming and handsome, and yes, engaged to be married, though that detail the letter got wrong. He was married already, but separated from his wife. I was young, stupid, and lonely. Charles had gone to India on business, leaving me in Cairo with friends. Peter paid me attention. I was flattered. She looked at them directly, unflinching. We had an affair, a brief, foolish affair, that ended when his wife arrived unexpectedly. "And his death?" Tommy asked gently. "A genuine accident. Peter was an avid horseman. He went riding in the desert, was thrown, and broke his neck. The horse returned without him, and by the time we found him, he was dead." Millicent's voice remained steady. "There was gossip, of course. There always is when a man dies, and there's been scandal. Some said his horse had been tampered with. Others suggested he'd been drinking. The truth was simply that he was reckless and unlucky." "But the gossip reached certain ears," Tuppence said thoughtfully. "Obviously. And now someone is using it against me. But who?" Millicent stood, pacing to the window. "Who here would know about Cairo? And why bring it up now?" "Harold mentioned it to me this morning," Tuppence said. "He claimed to have sources." Millicent spun around. "Harold? But he would have been a child when I was in Cairo. How could he possibly know?" "That," Tommy said, "is an excellent question. Either someone told him or he's been investigating me." Millicent finished bitterly. "On his mother's instructions, no doubt. Beatrice has always hated me. She'd love nothing more than to see Charles turn against me." "But the letter," Tuppence pointed out, "was sent anonymously. If Beatrice wanted to use this information, why not do it openly?" "Because it's more damaging this way. Anonymous accusations carry the weight of dark mystery, and they can't be challenged as directly." Millicent returned to her chair, suddenly looking very tired. "Tuppence, I won't lie. I was not proud of what I did in Cairo. I was discreet, and I ended it as soon as I realized what a mistake I'd made. Charles never knew. I saw no reason to hurt him with something that was over and meaningless." "But someone thinks they can use it against you now," Tommy said. "The question is, why? What do they hope to gain?" Before anyone could answer, there was a sharp knock at the door. Clara Morton entered, her expression troubled. "Forgive the interruption, Mrs. Hartley, but I thought you should know. Geoffrey has been making telephone calls. I happened to pass the telephone room and heard him speaking to someone in London. He mentioned lawyers and said something about grounds for contesting the will." "Contesting?" Millicent looked confused. "On what grounds?" Clara glanced at Tommy and Tuppence, then said carefully, "I believe he mentioned something about undue influence and your relationship with Mr. Hartley. Understanding dawned on Millicent's face. The Cairo scandal. If it becomes public, if Charles's family and friends begin to question my character, Geoffrey could argue that I manipulated Charles into changing his will against his own son's interests. Is that legally possible? Tuppence asked. With the right lawyer and enough mud thrown, anything is possible, Tommy said grimly. It wouldn't have to succeed. Merely casting doubt could delay probate for years, tie up the estate in litigation, which might be exactly what someone wants. Tuppence added slowly. If the estate is in legal limbo, who benefits? They looked at each other, the same thought occurring to all of them. Clara voiced it first. The business. If Charles's shares are tied up in probate disputes, unable to be sold or voted, Mr. Stein would have much more control over the company. Geoffrey and Stein working together, Tommy said. Geoffrey provides the grounds for contesting the will. Stein stands to benefit from the resulting chaos. But that means one of them sent the poison pen letter, Tuppence objected, and that seems rather direct. Why not simply use the information more subtly? Unless, Millicent said slowly, the letter wasn't meant to destroy me. Not immediately. It was meant to frighten Charles, to weaken him further, to perhaps trigger another heart episode. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. You're saying someone is trying to kill Charles, Clara said flatly, by frightening him to death. It's possible, Tommy said carefully. His heart is weak. Dr. Lavington has warned repeatedly about stress and excitement. A well-timed shock could be as deadly as poison. But who? Millicent began, then stopped. All of them. Geoffrey, certainly. Beatrice and Harold would profit if Charles died before changing his will. Stein has his own motives, even. She trailed off. Even you, Tuppence finished gently. That's what they'd say, isn't it? That you have the most to gain from Charles's death, especially if it happens before the Cairo scandal becomes widely known. Millicent's laugh was bitter. I've walked right into it, haven't I? By asking you here, by confiding in you about being frightened. If Charles dies, I'm the obvious suspect, unless we can prove who's really behind this, Tommy said. And to do that, we need more information. Clara, those letters you showed us, the ones from the first Mrs. Hartley. May we see them all? Clara looked uncertain. They're very personal. I promised Eleanor. Eleanor wanted the truth known, Tuppence said gently. And right now, we need every scrap of truth we can find. Something in those letters might help us understand what's really happening here. After a moment's hesitation, Clara nodded and left to fetch them. While she was gone, Tuppence moved to the window, looking out over the gardens where guests wandered in pairs or alone, each perhaps nurturing their own secrets and schemes. Tommy, she said quietly, what if we're wrong? What if there's no grand conspiracy, just a lot of unhappy people making each other miserable? Then Charles Hartley will make his announcement tomorrow. Everyone will be disappointed and angry, and we'll all go home nursing wounded feelings, but otherwise unharmed. Tommy came to stand beside her. But you don't believe that, do you? No, Tuppence admitted. I think someone in this house is dangerous. I think they're desperate. And I think Charles Hartley is in very real danger. Clara returned with the box of letters, and for the next hour, the four of them read through Eleanor Hartley's correspondence. The letters painted a picture of a woman who loved deeply, but not blindly, who knew her husband's flaws and chose to stay despite them. The revelation about Charles's earlier relationship and illegitimate child was in one of the last letters, written just weeks before Eleanor's death. She provided a name, Rose Merchant, and an address in London, along with the information that the child, a girl, would be about 15 years old when Eleanor wrote the letter. She'd be 35 now, Tommy calculated, if she's still alive and can be traced. But why would Eleanor want Geoffrey to know? Millicent wondered. Surely it would only hurt him to learn his father had another child. Read the end of the letter, Clara said quietly. Tuppence found the passage. I tell you this, my darling, boy, not to hurt you, but to help you understand that families are complicated things. You may someday have a sister who needs your help or your kindness. And you should know that your father, for all his faults, took care of his earlier mistake. He sends money regularly to Rose and her mother, and has done for years. He is not a perfect man, but he tries to do right by those he has wronged. I hope you will do the same if circumstances ever require it. So, Charles has been supporting them all along, Tommy said. Does anyone else know? The payments would go through his bank, Millicent said slowly. If someone had access to his accounts, they might notice regular payments to the same person. Geoffrey managed the estate, Clara pointed out. He would have had access. Or Stein, as business partner, Tommy added. He'd have a legitimate reason to review financial records. So one of them discovers the payments, investigates, and finds out about Rose, Tuppence said, thinking aloud. And then what? How does that help them? It depends on what Rose is like, Millicent said. If she's bitter about being kept secret, if she feels she deserves a share of Charles's estate, someone could use her as a weapon against Charles, or against me. Tuppence was about to respond when they heard shouting from downstairs. All four of them rushed to the staircase landing to see Geoffrey and Beatrice in the entrance hall below, their argument echoing through the house. Can't just waltz in here making demands, Geoffrey was saying. I'm not making demands, a new voice responded, cultured and firm. I'm simply claiming what is rightfully mine. A woman stood facing Geoffrey and Beatrice, an elegant figure in a travelling coat, with dark hair and Charles's distinctive nose and chin. She looked up at the landing, her gaze meeting Tuppence's, and smiled. You must be Millicent's friends, she said. How lovely to meet you. I'm Rose Merchant, Charles Hartley's daughter. And as Tuppence gripped the banister, feeling the case shift once again beneath her feet, she heard Millicent's soft gasp beside her and thought, the past has just arrived at Marshwood Manor, and it wasn't here to let bygones be bygones. The drawing room, hastily arranged for what was rapidly becoming an informal inquisition, had the tense atmosphere of a courtroom. Rose Merchant sat with perfect composure in a wingback chair, her travelling bag at her feet, while the rest of the household gathered around her in various states of shock, suspicion, or poorly concealed hostility. Charles had been helped downstairs, despite Dr. Lavington's protests, and he sat now staring at Rose with an expression that cycled between wonder, fear, and something that might have been recognition. "How did you find us?" Millicent asked, her voice remarkably steady given the circumstances. "I didn't have to find you. I've always known where my father was." Rose's voice was pleasant, but with an edge that suggested she was enjoying the disruption her arrival had caused. What changed was my decision to make myself known. When I learned about the house party and the announcement, it seemed timely. Timely, Beatrice repeated coldly. Or opportunistic. How do we even know you are who you claim to be? Rose opened her handbag and drew out a folded document. My birth certificate for a start. Rose Merchant, mother. Susan Merchant, father. Charles Hartley. Would you like to see it? Charles reached out with a shaking hand, and Rose passed it to him. He stared at it for a long moment, and when he looked up, his eyes were wet. "Rose," he said hoarsely, "my God, you're the image of your mother." "So I've been told." Rose's expression softened slightly. "She passed away 6 months ago. Cancer. It was quite sudden at the end." "Susan's dead?" Charles's voice broke. "I didn't know. She never said. She didn't want you to know. She was proud, my mother. She took your money because she had to. But she never wanted your pity or your presence." Rose leaned forward. "But before she died, she made me promise to come here, to meet you properly, to claim my place as your daughter. She said it was time for secrets to end." "How touching," Geoffrey said viciously. "And what exactly do you want, Miss Merchant? A share of the estate? Back payment for years of alleged neglect? Or simply to disrupt everything?" "I want," Rose said clearly, "what any daughter wants. Acknowledgement. Perhaps some understanding. And yes, if it comes to it, my fair share of my father's estate. I am his child, after all. Older than you, as it happens." "By a few years," Charles murmured, still staring at her. "You must be 36 now. 37 in December. Yes, I'm the elder child, which in some families would make me the primary heir." Rose smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Though I understand you've been rather busy recently, changing your will and making arrangements." "How do you know about that?" Tommy asked sharply. For the first time, Rose looked slightly uncomfortable. "I have my sources. Someone wrote to me, actually. Told me that my father was home after years abroad and planning to settle his affairs. Suggested that if I had any interest in claiming my birthright, now would be the time." "Who wrote to you?" Tuppence demanded. The letter was unsigned. Rose reached into her bag again and produced an envelope. "See for yourself." Tuppence took it, noting immediately that the handwriting matched the poison pen letter sent to Charles about Millicent. The same hand, the same malicious intent, but working to different ends. "Someone," Tommy said quietly to Tuppence, "is orchestrating all of this, bringing Rose here, exposing Millicent's past, stirring up all possible trouble." "But why?" Tuppence whispered back. Before Tommy could answer, Dr. Lavington stood abruptly. "This is enough. Charles needs rest. This entire situation is medical madness. Miss Merchant, I don't doubt you are who you claim, but your timing is appalling. The announcement can wait until tomorrow as planned, but for now, Charles must rest." "Of course," Rose said, suddenly contrite. "Forgive me. I didn't mean to cause distress. Perhaps someone could show me to a room. I've come all the way from London, and I'm rather tired myself." The awkwardness of having to provide hospitality to the unwelcome guest hung in the air until Millicent, with remarkable grace, stood and said, "I'll have Mrs. Talbot prepare the blue room. You're welcome to stay, Miss Merchant, though I confess your arrival has been something of a shock to all of us." "I imagine it has," Rose said, meeting Millicent's eyes, "though probably more of a shock to you than to him. Did you know about me, stepmother?" "I did not," Millicent said evenly, "though I'm learning all sorts of interesting things this weekend." As Rose was shown upstairs, the remaining guests dispersed with the relief of prisoners granted temporary reprieve. Charles, exhausted and shaken, allowed Dr. Lavington and Millicent to help him back to his room. Tommy and Tuppence found themselves alone in the drawing-room with Clara Morton, who had been observing everything with her usual quiet attention. "Well," Clara said, "that was illuminating, wasn't it just?" Tuppence agreed. "Clara, you knew about Rose. Eleanor's letters mentioned her." "I knew of her existence. I didn't expect to meet her here." Clara looked troubled. "This changes everything, doesn't it? If Charles acknowledges her, includes her in his will, Geoffrey's share shrinks even further," Tommy finished, "and Beatrice and Harold's expectations become even more remote." "But someone wanted her here," Tuppence said, holding up the anonymous letter. "Someone who knew about Rose and deliberately brought her into the situation. The question is why? What do they gain from making everything more complicated?" "Chaos," Clara said simply. "Perhaps that's the point. Create enough confusion, enough conflict, and in the midst of it all—" She didn't finish the sentence, but they all thought it. In the midst of it all, Charles Hartley might simply die. From stress, from shock, from his weakened heart finally giving out, and with enough suspects and motives swirling around, proving anyone's guilt would be nearly impossible. "We need to talk to Rose," Tuppence said. "Find out what she knows, what she really wants. And we need to find out who sent that letter," Tommy added. "Clara, the handwriting, do you recognize it?" Clara studied the letter carefully. "It's disguised, I think, made deliberately unclear, but there's something about it." She trailed off, frowning. "May I keep this? I'd like to compare it to some other documents." "What documents?" Tuppence asked. "Household papers, old letters. I've kept quite a bit over the years. Eleanor's correspondence, household accounts, notes from various people. If this handwriting belongs to someone in the house, there might be something to match it against." Tommy handed over the letter. "Be careful, Clara. If someone is orchestrating all of this, they won't want their role discovered." "I'm always careful," Clara said, but her smile was tight. After she'd gone, Tommy and Tuppence remained in the drawing room, both thinking hard. "It's like a puzzle box," Tuppence said finally. "Every time we think we understand one piece, a new compartment opens up. Geoffrey and Stein, Beatrice and Harold, Millicent's past, Rose's arrival, they all connect somehow. But I can't see the pattern." "The pattern," Tommy said slowly, "is that everyone has a motive to want Charles dead or discredited. Everyone except Millicent, who has the most to gain from his living, and us, who have no stake at all. Which makes us dangerous," Tuppence realized. "To whoever is pulling the strings, we're observers who might see too much." As if summoning danger by naming it, the lights suddenly went out. The drawing room plunged into darkness, and Tuppence felt, rather than saw, Tommy move closer to her. "Generator failure," she whispered. "Possibly. Or someone's idea of a diversion." They moved carefully toward the door, feeling their way in the darkness. From upstairs came sounds of confusion, voices calling out questions. Then, cutting through the noise, a woman's scream, sharp, terrified, and abruptly cut off. Tommy and Tuppence ran toward the staircase, colliding with other guests doing the same. Someone had produced an electric torch, its beam swinging wildly across walls and faces. The scream came from the west wing. Harold's voice said from somewhere in the darkness, near the guest rooms. They mounted the stairs in a confused group, the torch beam leading the way. At the end of the corridor, they found Clara Morton, shaking and pale, standing outside a door that hung open. "What happened?" Tuppence demanded, reaching her first. Clara pointed into the room. Rose Merchant's room, Tuppence realised. The torch beam swung inside, revealing chaos. The travelling bag had been upended, clothes strewn across the floor, the mattress half off the bed, and on the mirror, written in what looked like lipstick in the uncertain light, was a message. "Go home or die." "Where's Rose?" Tommy asked urgently. "I don't know," Clara gasped. "I came to bring her fresh towels and found this." The scream. "I thought it came from inside, but when I looked, the room was empty." They searched the room thoroughly, but Rose Merchant was gone. The window stood open, curtains billowing in the night breeze. Below was a drop to the terrace, possible to climb down, but dangerous in the dark. "She must have fled," Beatrice said from the doorway, frightened away by the threat. "Or taken," Tuppence said quietly. "Look at the struggle. This room wasn't just searched. There was a fight." The lights chose that moment to come back on, the sudden brightness making everyone blink. In the clear light, the room looked even more disturbing. Signs of violence everywhere, and that message on the mirror now revealed to be written in blood-red lipstick, stark and threatening. Dr. Lavington appeared, breathless from climbing the stairs. "What's happened?" "I heard screaming. Rose Merchant has disappeared," Tommy said, "and under circumstances that suggest she didn't go willingly." "We should call the police," Harold said. "No," Geoffrey's voice was sharp. "Not yet. She's probably just playing for sympathy, staging a disappearance to make herself seem like a victim." "Or she's actually in danger," Tuppence countered. "As are we all if we don't take this seriously." "Charles," Millicent said suddenly. "Someone should check on Charles. If Rose is truly missing, if something's happened, the shock could—" But she didn't finish, because a cry from the master bedroom told them that someone already had. They rushed down the corridor to find Charles sitting up in bed, his face ashen, clutching at his chest. "My medication," he gasped. "Someone's taken my medication." Dr. Lavington pushed through the crowd. "What? That's impossible. Look!" Charles pointed at the bedside table. The bottle that had been there earlier was gone. "I woke when the lights came on, reached for it, and it wasn't there. Someone came in while I was sleeping and took it." "We'll find it," Lavington said, though his expression was grim. "Try to stay calm. I have more in my bag." "No!" Charles's voice was surprisingly strong despite his distress. "Don't you see? Someone is trying to kill me, and they almost succeeded." He looked around at the assembled company, his gaze settling on each face in turn. "One of you wants me dead, and tonight you tried to make it happen." The accusation hung in the air, and Tuppence felt a chill run down her spine, because Charles was right. The lights, the chaos, Rose's disappearance, all of it could have been orchestrated to create confusion, to provide cover for someone to slip into Charles's room and take his medication. If Dr. Lavington hadn't had additional supplies, if Charles had suffered another attack without his medicine, he could have died. And in the confusion, with everyone running about in the darkness, proving who had done it would be nearly impossible. "From now on," Tommy said firmly, "no one goes anywhere alone. We move in pairs, we watch each other, and we keep our doors locked. And in the morning, whether anyone likes it or not, we're calling the police." No one argued. Even Geoffrey, who had opposed official involvement, looked shaken enough to agree. As they dispersed to their rooms, in pairs, as Tommy had ordered, Tuppence caught a glimpse of Clara slipping away toward the servants' stairs. On impulse, she followed, leaving Tommy to accompany Dr. Lavington. She caught up with Clara on the back stairs, the older woman moving with surprising speed. "Clara, wait!" Clara turned, and in the dim light of the stairwell, her expression was frightened. "I think I know who's behind this," she whispered. "The handwriting, I found a match. But Mrs. Beresford, I can't prove it. And if I'm right, we're all in terrible danger." "Who?" Tuppence demanded. But before Clara could answer, there was a rush of movement from above. Someone pushed past Tuppence, shoving her hard against the wall. Clara screamed and tried to run, but the figure caught her, and there was a brief, violent struggle. Then Clara was falling, tumbling down the narrow stairs with a horrible, sickening series of thuds. She landed at the bottom in a crumpled heap and lay still. Tuppence, recovering her balance, raced down after her, but the damage was already done. Clara's eyes were open but unseeing, her neck bent at an impossible angle. And when Tuppence looked up the stairs, desperate to see who had pushed them, all she saw was a shadow disappearing around the corner, and the faint echo of running footsteps. Clara Morton, who had known everyone's secrets, was dead, and Tuppence had no idea who had killed her. The police arrived at dawn, summoned by a pale and shaken Dr. Lavington. Inspector Davids of the Sussex Constabulary was a solid, methodical man in his 50s who listened to the confused accounts of the night's events with a growing frown. "So," he said, once he'd interviewed everyone individually, "we have one woman missing, this Rose Merchant, and one woman dead, fallen down the back stairs in circumstances you claim were not accidental." "Mrs. Beresford, I don't claim," Tuppence said firmly. "Someone pushed us. Clara fell. I didn't only by luck, but you didn't see who? It was dark. They moved too quickly." Tuppence's frustration was evident. "But Inspector, Clara had just told me she knew who was behind everything. She'd matched the handwriting from an anonymous letter." "Which letter?" Davies interrupted. Tuppence explained about the poison pen letter to Charles, and the anonymous note that brought Rose to Marshwood. Clara said she'd found a match in old household papers. She was about to tell me who when someone pushed us. "These papers? Where are they?" "In her room, presumably. She had a box of old letters and documents." But when they searched Clara's room, the box was gone. The room had been thoroughly ransacked, drawers emptied, the mattress pulled aside. Whoever had killed Clara had taken the evidence she'd discovered. "This is looking less like an unfortunate accident," Davies admitted, surveying the destruction. "Though I'll need more than your word that someone pushed you, Mrs. Beresford." "What about the bruises on her arm?" Tommy suggested. "Where someone grabbed her." The doctor who'd come with the police confirmed it. Bruising consistent with someone having gripped Clara's arm violently. Combined with Tuppence's testimony and the ransacked room, it was enough for Davies to declare Clara's death suspicious. "No one leaves," he announced to the assembled household. "This is now a criminal investigation. I'll need to interview each of you again, more thoroughly. And I want to know everything about this Rose Merchant who's conveniently disappeared." "You think she's involved?" Beatrice asked. "I think her arrival and her disappearance are remarkably well-timed," Davies said dryly. "Whether she's a victim or a villain remains to be determined." The morning dragged on with interviews and searches. Geoffrey was hostile and defensive. Stein was smooth and unhelpful. Beatrice was coldly superior. Harold seemed genuinely shocked by Clara's death, and Millicent was quiet and contained, her earlier warmth replaced by an understandable wariness. Charles, kept to his bed by Dr. Lavington, gave what information he could but seemed more confused than enlightening. Yes, he admitted, he had fathered a child with Susan Merchant. Yes, he'd been supporting them financially. No, he hadn't known Rose planned to appear. Yes, his will was recently changed. but the details were private until the formal announcement. By midday, Inspector Davies had established a timeline, but little else. The power had been cut at approximately 9:45 p.m. Someone had thrown the main switch in the cellar. The generator failure was deliberate. Rose had been seen going to her room at 9:30 p.m. Clara had discovered the ransacked room around 10 p.m. and screamed. Clara's death occurred approximately 10:15 p.m. on the back stairs. The problem, Davies confided to Tommy and Tuppence, is that everyone was running around in the dark. No one has a solid alibi. Anyone could have cut the power, ransacked the room, taken the medication from Charles's bedside, and pushed Miss Morton down the stairs. But not all of those things, Tuppence objected. One person couldn't have been in multiple places at once. There must have been coordination, or we're looking at multiple crimes by different people. Or, Tommy said thoughtfully, the crimes aren't all connected. The power cut and Rose's disappearance might be genuine. Someone frightening her away or taking her. But Clara's death, that was about silencing her, about stopping her from revealing what she'd discovered. Then we need to know what she discovered, David said. These letters you mentioned, from the first Mrs. Hartley. Do you remember what they contained? Tuppence did, and she related the information about Charles's past, the secret daughter, and Eleanor's careful documentation of family history. But there was more than that. Clara had kept years of household papers. If she found something in those documents, a match to the anonymous letters, it must have been something recent, or something that would identify someone currently in the house. Handwriting can be checked, Davies said. I'll need samples from everyone. While the inspector organized that, Tommy drew Tuppence aside. I've been thinking about the medication that was stolen. Why take it, if the goal was to kill Charles? Why not simply smother him while he slept in the darkness? Why take the medicine and hope he'd have an attack? Because the medicine might be needed for something else, Tuppence said slowly. Or because, Tommy, what if it wasn't about killing Charles at all? What if someone wanted the medication for another purpose? Such as giving it to someone else, making them ill, or making their death look natural. Tuppence's eyes widened. What if Rose was given the medication? What if she's not missing but dead, and made to look like she died of natural causes? Charles's medication is for his heart. If given to someone healthy, in large enough doses, it could cause severe problems. Tommy stared at her. That's diabolically clever, and it would explain why someone went to the trouble of staging Rose's disappearance, rather than simply disposing of her more directly. They took this theory to Inspector Davies, who looked troubled. If you're right, we need to find Rose Merchant's body, and we need to determine if she was given medication she shouldn't have had. She could be anywhere on the estate, Tommy said. The grounds are extensive and in the darkness. But she couldn't have been taken far, Tuppence interrupted. Not without a vehicle, and none were heard leaving, which means she's hidden somewhere nearby. The house itself, Davies said decisively. We'll search every room, every closet, every conceivable hiding place. The search began immediately, but it was Tuppence who found the crucial clue. In the library, supposedly searching the shelves for any space large enough to conceal a body, she noticed something odd about one of the bookcases. Tommy, look at this. The bookcase, a floor-to-ceiling affair in dark oak, stood slightly proud of the wall. When Tommy pushed it, it swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow passageway. Secret passages, Tuppence breathed. Of course, an old house like this. There are probably several. They followed the passage which ran between the walls, dark and dusty. It branched in several directions, and Tuppence realized with growing excitement that it probably connected to multiple rooms in the house. "This is how someone moved around unseen last night," she said. "They used these passages to get from place to place while everyone else was blundering about in the darkness. One branch led upward toward the guest rooms. Another went down, possibly to the cellars. They followed the upward passage and emerged through another hidden door into a small unused bedroom in the west wing. And there, on the bed, they found Rose Merchant. She was unconscious but breathing, her face flushed, her pulse rapid and irregular. Beside her on the nightstand was Charles's missing medication bottle, half empty. "Get Davies!" Tommy barked, already checking Rose's vital signs. "And Dr. Lavington! She's been poisoned!" The next hour was frantic. Rose was carried to a proper bedroom. Dr. Lavington worked frantically to treat the overdose, and Inspector Davies stood by grimly, knowing that if Rose died, this would officially become a murder investigation with multiple victims. But Rose was young and strong, and Lavington's prompt treatment saved her. By early evening, she was conscious enough to speak, though weakly. "I don't remember much," she whispered. Davies and the Beresfords gathered around her bed. "I went to my room after being shown upstairs. I was unpacking when I heard a noise. Someone had come in through a door in the panelling I hadn't noticed. They said they wanted to talk about my father, about the inheritance. I thought it was peculiar, but I agreed." "Who was it?" Davies pressed. "I couldn't see properly. They stayed in shadow. They offered me a drink, brandy, they said, to settle my nerves after the journey. I drank it and then—" She struggled to remember. "Then everything became confused. I felt ill, frightened. They said I should lie down, helped me through the passage to another room. I thought I was going to die." "But why would someone do this?" Millicent asked. "If they wanted to kill you, why save you from falling and then poison you?" "They didn't want to kill me," Rose said faintly. "At least, not immediately. They wanted information. They kept asking me about my mother, about what she'd told me, about whether I had any documents or evidence beyond my birth certificate. I tried to answer, but I couldn't think clearly." "Did you have other evidence?" Tommy asked. Rose nodded weakly. "Letters. From my father to my mother over the years. Proof of his support, his acknowledgement of me. They were in my travelling bag. Whoever poisoned me must have searched my room and taken them. So the ransacking wasn't just for show," Tuppence said. "Someone wanted those letters." "But why?" Davies was frustrated. "What could old love letters prove that would be worth murder?" "That depends on what they said," Tommy replied. "If Charles wrote anything about his business dealings, his relationships with other family members, his plans for the future, those letters could contain all sorts of damaging information." Rose closed her eyes, exhausted by the conversation. Dr. Lavington shooed everyone out, insisting she needed rest. In the hallway, Davies looked at the Beresfords. "You two seem to have a better grasp of this than I do. What's really going on here?" Tommy and Tuppence exchanged glances. They'd been piecing together the puzzle all day, comparing notes between interviews, and they thought they were finally beginning to see the shape of the solution. "Inspector," Tuppence said, "how much do you know about Charles Hartley's business partnership with Ronald Stein?" "Only what Mr. Hartley told me, that they've been partners for 20 years. managing various investments and properties. Then, you should know, Tommy said, that Stein has been systematically buying up shares in their company while Charles was abroad. We learned this from Millicent. According to her, Charles recently became suspicious that Stein was planning some sort of takeover. Business disputes are hardly unusual, Davies said. No, but add in Geoffrey's resentment and desperate financial situation. Add in Charles's weak heart and a house full of people with motives to see him dead or discredited. Then add in a series of events designed to create maximum stress and confusion. Anonymous letters, Rose's sudden appearance, Clara's investigation. Tuppence counted them off on her fingers. It all points to someone orchestrating a campaign to either kill Charles or drive him to a fatal heart attack. "And you think it's Stein?" Davies asked. "We think Stein is involved," Tommy corrected. "But we don't think he's working alone. Someone in this house is helping him. Someone with access to the family's secrets and the household's daily workings." "Geoffrey is the obvious choice," Davies said. "Too obvious," Tuppence objected. "Geoffrey is reckless and desperate, but he's not particularly clever. This scheme requires planning, patience, and a thorough knowledge of everyone's weaknesses. It requires someone who's been watching and waiting, gathering information over years." "Who then?" Davies demanded. Tuppence and Tommy looked at each other. They had their suspicions, but no proof. Not yet. "We need to see Clara's room one more time," Tuppence said. "The person who searched it was looking for the handwriting samples she'd matched. But Clara was methodical, careful. She might have hidden something, made a backup." They returned to Clara's ransacked room, and this time Tuppence searched with purpose. If Clara knew she was in danger, if she'd suspected she might need to prove her findings, where would she hide the evidence? It was Tommy who found it. A thin envelope tucked inside the frame of Eleanor Hartley's photograph, so cleverly concealed that only someone looking specifically for hidden items would discover it. Inside were 2 documents, one of the anonymous letters and a page from an old household account book. At first, Tuppence couldn't see the connection. Then Tommy pointed out a notation in the margins, written in what was unmistakably the same hand as the anonymous letter. "The notation is dated 20 years ago," he said, "and it's signed with initials, C.M. Clara Morton." They stared at each other in shock. Clara wrote the letters? Tuppence couldn't believe it. But she was the one who was killed. Why would she threaten herself? Unless, Tommy said slowly, she didn't write the recent letters. Someone else did, copying her handwriting from these old documents. Clara recognized her own hand, realized someone was framing her, or using her old writing as a template. And when she tried to expose them, Tuppence finished, they killed her. Inspector Davies examined the evidence. "This matches what Mrs. Morton told you before she died, that she'd found the handwriting. She meant she'd found her own handwriting being used by someone else. Someone who had access to old household papers," Tommy said, "and someone who could study Clara's hand and imitate it well enough to pass casual inspection. Someone who wanted to create anonymous threats without them being traced back to themselves," Tuppence added. They looked at each other as understanding dawned. "We need to gather everyone," Davies said. "Tonight. No more delays, no more secrets. We'll expose this killer before anyone else dies." and as they made their plans, Tuppence felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and dread that came with every revelation. They knew who the killer was now, but proving it, and doing so safely, was another matter entirely. The endgame was approaching, and in Marshwood Manor, with a would-be murderer growing desperate, the final confrontation promised to be anything but easy. The drawing room had never seemed so large or so fraught with tension. Inspector Davies had insisted on a formal gathering of all parties, arranged as if for one of Charles Hartley's announcements. But this revelation would come from quite a different source. Charles sat in his customary chair, looking frail but alert, with Dr. Lavington close at hand. Millicent stood beside her husband, one hand protectively on his shoulder. Geoffrey slumped in a corner, sullen and defensive, while Beatrice and Harold maintained their icy distance near the fireplace. Ronald Stein occupied a chair by the window, his expression carefully neutral, but his fingers drumming restlessly on the armrest. Rose Merchant, still weak but recovering, had insisted on attending, and sat wrapped in a blanket, her eyes moving from face to face with undisguised curiosity. Inspector Davies stood near the door, ready to prevent any attempted escape, Tuppence thought, while she and Tommy had been given chairs in the centre of the room, positioned to observe everyone. "Thank you all for coming," Davies began. "I know it's been a distressing day following an even more distressing night, but certain facts have come to light that require explanation, and I believe Mr. and Mrs. Beresford are best positioned to provide that explanation." All eyes turned to the Beresfords. Tuppence felt the familiar flutter of nervousness she always experienced before these moments, tempered by her confidence in what they'd discovered. Tommy spoke first, his voice calm and measured. "When we arrived at Marshwood Manor, we thought we were coming to support an old friend during a difficult family gathering. What we found instead was a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare, designed to either kill Charles Hartley or drive him to a fatal heart attack." "That's absurd," Geoffrey interjected. "No one here—" "Let him finish," Davies said sharply. Tommy continued. The campaign had several components. First, the poison pen letter about Millicent's past in Cairo, designed to create shock and stress for Charles. Second, the anonymous letter bringing Rose to Marshwood, adding another layer of complication and potential conflict. Third, the theft of Charles's medication during last night's chaos, ensuring he'd be left vulnerable during a moment of distress. These actions, Tuppence picked up the thread, were all aimed at the same goal, either killing Charles directly or creating circumstances that would lead to his death from natural causes. But they were also designed to create multiple suspects and maximum confusion, making it nearly impossible to determine who was responsible. "Clara Morton discovered the truth," Tommy said. "She realized that the anonymous letters were written in a hand she recognized, her own. Someone had studied examples of her handwriting from old household documents and was using it to create untraceable threats. When she confronted this person, or was about to reveal them, she was pushed down the stairs." "And Rose was poisoned," Tuppence added, "not to kill her immediately, but to incapacitate her and steal the letters her father had written to her mother. Letters that contained information someone desperately needed to conceal or control." Stein leaned forward. "This is all very theatrical, but do you have any actual proof? Or are you just spinning theories?" "We have proof," Tommy said. "But first, let's discuss motivation. Why would someone want Charles dead?" The obvious answer is inheritance. Geoffrey stands to inherit, albeit less than he'd like. Beatrice and Harold have expectations based on Charles's promise to his late sister. Even Millicent, Charles's wife, would benefit financially from his death. But, Tuppence interjected, none of them would benefit from the chaos. Geoffrey wants his inheritance secured, not contested. Beatrice and Harold want Charles to die before changing his will further, not after creating conditions that might make the will vulnerable to challenge. And Millicent wants Charles alive. His death removes her protector and leaves her vulnerable to accusations of gold-digging or worse. So who does benefit from chaos? Tommy asked rhetorically. Someone whose interest lies not in a clean inheritance, but in a muddled one. Someone who profits from the estate being tied up in legal battles, from Charles's business affairs being thrown into confusion, from the family being too distracted by scandal and suspicion to properly oversee their interests. Ronald Stein, Millicent said suddenly, understanding dawning. You've been buying up shares in the company. If Charles dies and the estate is tied up in probate disputes, I'd have effective control, Stein finished, his mask of neutrality finally slipping. Is that your theory, Mrs. Beresford? That I've orchestrated all of this for business advantage? Not just for business advantage, Tommy corrected. Clara's box of letters contained one we found particularly interesting. A letter from Eleanor Hartley to Charles, written just before her death, expressing concern about his partnership with you. She wrote that she'd discovered irregularities in the business accounts, money that couldn't be accounted for. Stein's face had gone very pale. That's a lie. I've never seen such a letter. Because Charles never did, Tuppence said. Eleanor died before she could show it to him, and Clara kept the letter with the others, uncertain what to do with it. She showed it to us yesterday, mentioned that she'd been considering whether to bring it to Charles's attention now that he was home. And you killed her to prevent that, Inspector Davies said, moving slightly closer to Stein. You knew that if Charles saw that letter, he'd audit the business properly and discover what you'd been doing. Embezzlement, Tommy said flatly. You've been siphoning money from the business for years, disguising it as failed investments or business expenses. Eleanor noticed the discrepancies. Clara had documented evidence of it in old household accounts that cross-referenced with business records. When you learned Charles was coming home and planning to settle his affairs, you realized you'd be exposed, Tuppence continued. So you devised this scheme, create a crisis, apply pressure to Charles's weak heart, and either he'd die before auditing the books, or he'd die in circumstances so confused that no one would notice irregularities in the business during the chaos that followed. Stein had stood, his hands clenched. You can't prove any of this, even if Eleanor wrote such a letter, even if Clara had suspicions. We have your handwriting, Davies said, producing the documents they'd found hidden in Clara's room. Samples taken from household records that matched the anonymous letters. You studied Clara's hand from old account books and correspondence, practicing until you could forge it convincingly. You sent the letter to Rose, Tommy said, because you needed her here to complicate the inheritance situation. You sent the letter about Millicent because you needed Charles stressed and vulnerable. You stole his medication not to kill him directly, but to ensure he'd be without it if you managed to trigger another attack. And when Clara realized what you'd done, Tuppence said softly, when she discovered her own handwriting being used and began to investigate, you followed her, pushed her down the stairs, and ransacked her room to destroy any evidence she'd gathered. The secret passages, Stein said suddenly, bitterly. Damned Gothic nonsense. I didn't know they existed until Geoffrey mentioned them in passing months ago. Made it too easy to move around unseen. You've confessed, Davies said, almost surprised. Stein laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. What's the point in denying it now? You've worked it all out, and yes, I'll admit, I've been borrowing from the business for years. Charles was always abroad, always distracted. It was easy. But then he came home, started making noises about settling affairs, bringing in auditors. His voice turned vicious. Everything would have been fine if he'd just died quietly in India, like his wife did. You killed Eleanor, Millicent gasped. Fever, Stein said with a shrug. Completely natural in that climate, though I may have helped things along a bit when I visited them in Bombay. A little something in her evening drink to weaken her immunity. Who could prove it after so many years? The room erupted. Charles tried to lunge at Stein, but was held back by Dr. Lavington. Geoffrey looked genuinely shocked. Even Beatrice seemed horrified, her usual composure cracking. Davies moved swiftly, producing handcuffs. Ronald Stein, I'm arresting you for the murder of Clara Morton, the attempted murders of Rose Merchant and Charles Hartley, and suspicion of involvement in the death of Eleanor Hartley. You are not obliged to say anything. But Stein wasn't listening. He'd pulled a small revolver from his jacket pocket, something he must have kept concealed throughout the day, and was backing towards the French windows. I won't hang, he said coldly. I've worked too hard, come too far. If I'm ruined, I'll be ruined on my own terms. Don't be a fool, Davies said, but he'd stopped advancing, wary of the gun. Stein glanced around the room one last time, his expression a mixture of rage and resignation. Then he turned and ran through the French windows onto the terrace. Tommy and Davies gave chase, but Stein had a head start. They watched as he raced across the lawn toward the cliffs at the edge of the property. The November darkness was falling fast, shadows lengthening across the grass. He's heading for the cliff path, Tommy shouted. There's a drop to the beach. But Stein either didn't know about the drop or didn't care. They saw him reach the edge, saw him hesitate for just a moment, and then, whether he jumped or simply misjudged the darkness, he was gone. When they reached the cliff edge and looked down, they could see his body on the rocks below, motionless in the gathering dark. Inspector Davies sighed heavily. Well, that's one way to avoid the hangman. They returned to the house to find the others exactly as they'd left them, frozen in shock. Tommy gave a brief nod, and everyone understood. It's over, he said simply. The immediate aftermath of Stein's death was organized chaos. Inspector Davies arranged for the body to be recovered, made his official pronouncements, and began the process of wrapping up the case. Dr. Lavington tended to Charles, who'd suffered another mild episode during the confrontation, but was recovering with medication and rest. Rose, Millicent, and even Beatrice had all retreated to their respective rooms, exhausted by the revelations. Geoffrey had disappeared to the library with a bottle of whiskey, and Harold was helping his mother pack. They'd be leaving in the morning, all pretense of civility abandoned. It was near midnight when Tuppence and Tommy finally found themselves alone in the drawing room, the scene of the evening's dramatic confrontation now quiet and empty. Well, Tuppence said, sinking into a chair with relief. That was rather more exciting than I'd anticipated. You thought it would be dull? Tommy asked, pouring them both a brandy. I thought it would be awkward family drama. I didn't expect multiple attempted murders and a man throwing himself off a cliff. Technically, he might have jumped or fallen. The coroner will have to determine that. Tommy handed her a glass and settled into the chair beside her. though I suspect they'll rule it suicide. Stein must have known he was facing the hangman. Poor Clara, Tuppence said softly. She tried to do the right thing to warn us, and it got her killed. She knew the risks. These old houses and their secrets. They're dangerous in the wrong hands. Tommy stared into his brandy. I keep thinking about what Stein said about Eleanor. Do you think he really killed her? Probably, though proving it after all these years will be impossible. She was cremated in India. There's no evidence to examine. Tuppence shook her head. But Charles knows the truth now. That's something, I suppose. He knows his first wife died because of his business partner's greed. And he knows he has another daughter, Tommy added. Rose plans to stay for a few days, get to know him properly. Millicent has been remarkably gracious about it all. She's a good woman, better than the Hartley family deserves, honestly. Tuppence glanced toward the door, then lowered her voice. Tommy, there's something that's been bothering me. Why did Stein ransack Rose's room before poisoning her? Why not poison her first, then search at leisure? Tommy considered. Perhaps he needed her conscious initially, to question her about the letters, to find out what she knew. But she said she couldn't remember much, and Stein seemed to know exactly what he was looking for. Tuppence set down her glass. Tommy, what if Stein wasn't working entirely alone? What if he had help? You mean Geoffrey? Tommy frowned. I suppose it's possible. Geoffrey certainly has motive, and he knew about the secret passages, not Geoffrey. He's too obvious, too volatile. Stein would have chosen someone more subtle, someone with access to the household's daily operations, someone who could move around unnoticed and gather information. Tuppence stood, pacing to the window. Someone like Harold. Tommy's eyebrows rose. Beatrice's son? Think about it. Harold works in London in finance. He'd be perfectly positioned to help Stein with the business manipulations, to provide cover for the embezzlement. And he was surprisingly knowledgeable about Millicent's past. He told me about the Cairo incident with such specific detail that it made me wonder where he'd gotten his information. From Stein, Tommy realized, who got it from old correspondence he'd found while searching through Charles's papers. Exactly, and Harold was very quick to suggest calling the police after Rose disappeared. But only after Clara was already dead, and the evidence in her room destroyed. Before that, he'd been pushing for the family to handle matters privately. They looked at each other, the same thought occurring to both of them. If Harold had been helping Stein, he might still be in the house, undetected and dangerous. We should tell Davies, Tuppence said. But before they could move, the door opened. Harold stepped in, and something in his expression told them he'd been listening. You're very clever, he said, pulling the door closed behind him. Though not quite clever enough. You've solved Stein's crimes, but missed mine. His hand came up, and in it was the revolver that had disappeared after Stein's death. The one Davies had been too busy to immediately secure from the terrace where it had fallen. You took the gun, Tommy said, moving slightly to place himself between Harold and Tuppence. I did. Figured it might come in useful. Harold's smile was cold. Stein was always too clever for his own good. He had this elaborate plan, all this psychological manipulation. I told him just to smother Charles in his sleep and be done with it. But he insisted on his way. And look how that worked out. The police know about Stein's crimes, Tuppence said carefully. Killing us won't help you, won't it? Everyone thinks Stein acted alone. Geoffrey's too drunk to think straight. Mother's too proud to believe I'd be involved in anything sordid, and Charles is too ill to press for further investigation. Harold gestured with the gun toward the French windows. We're going for a walk, down to the cliffs. Such a tragic accident. You went out in the dark to see where Stein fell, lost your footing, and tumbled down yourselves. Very sad. No one will believe that, Tommy said. They will if I'm convincingly distraught when I report finding your bodies. I've always been a good actor. Harold moved closer. Now walk. Don't make me shoot you here. It would complicate the staging. They had no choice. Tommy and Tuppence moved toward the French windows. Harold following at a safe distance, the gun trained on them. Outside, the November night was cold and dark, clouds covering the moon. They could hear the sea crashing against the rocks below the cliffs, a sound that suddenly seemed ominous rather than romantic. "Why did you do it?" Tuppence asked, hoping to buy time. "You had expectations from Charles, but surely not enough to justify murder." "Expectations!" Harold laughed bitterly. "Mother's been bleeding her own inheritance dry for years, trying to maintain appearances. Charles promised to help, but never did. Always put it off. When Stein approached me last year with his proposition, I saw a way out. Help him embezzle from the business, get a cut of the profits, and eventually Charles dies. The estate gets tied up in probate for years, and Stein and I run the company. Perfect. Except Stein's dead, and your plan is ruined," Tommy pointed out. "Which is why you need to be dead too. With you gone, Davies will close the case. Stein confessed to everything. No one will keep digging." They'd reached the cliff path now, the drop to the rocks visible even in the darkness. "This is far enough. Turn around." Tuppence's mind was racing. If they turned, Harold would shoot them in the back and push them over. Simple, brutal, and effective. They needed a distraction, a way to disarm him. "Harold!" A voice called from the terrace. "Harold, where are you?" It was Beatrice, her voice sharp with maternal authority. Harold's attention flickered for just a second, and Tommy moved. He lunged sideways, knocking Tuppence away from the gun's trajectory, and charged at Harold. The gun went off, the shot loud in the quiet night. Tuppence heard Tommy grunt, but couldn't tell if he'd been hit. The two men grappled at the cliff's edge, dangerously close to the drop. "Tommy!" Tuppence screamed, running toward them. But it was Harold who stumbled backward, his foot catching on a loose stone. He teetered on the edge, arms windmilling, and for a moment it seemed he might regain his balance. Then, with a cry of fear and fury, he fell. Tommy collapsed to his knees, breathing hard. Tuppence reached him, hands frantically checking for wounds. "I'm fine," he gasped. Bullet missed, hit his arm, threw off his aim. Below, Harold's body lay motionless on the same rocks that had claimed Stein. 2 deaths in one night, both at the same location. Davies was going to have a field day with the investigation. Beatrice appeared at the cliff edge, her face white with shock. When she saw Harold's body below, she made a sound, part gasp, part moan, and sank to the ground. "I knew," she whispered. "I suspected he was involved in something with Stein, but I didn't want to believe. My son, my boy." Inspector Davies arrived moments later, summoned by the gunshot. When he understood what had happened, his expression was grim. 2 deaths in one location within hours, he said. "I'll need statements from all of you. This is unprecedented." "It was self-defense," Tuppence said firmly. "Harold tried to kill us. He was Stein's accomplice. He admitted it. I heard him," Beatrice said unexpectedly. All eyes turned to her. "I followed him when he left the house. I'd been suspicious all evening, the way he kept watching you both. I heard him confess to helping Stein. Heard him threaten you." She looked at Davies, her usual hauteur replaced by broken dignity. "My son was a criminal inspector, a murderer's accomplice, and now he's paid for it." The rest of the night passed in a blur of statements and procedures. By dawn, Davies had everything he needed to close the case. Stein and Harold had been working together, planning to embezzle from the business and eliminate anyone who discovered their scheme. Clara had died because she'd found evidence of the forgeries. Rose had been poisoned because her letters might have contained information linking Stein to financial irregularities. Though Davies admitted privately to Tommy and Tuppence as dawn broke, we'll never know exactly how much was Stein's plan and how much was Harold's. They took those secrets with them. Does it matter? Tuppence asked tiredly. They're both dead. Charles is safe. The embezzlement will come out in the audit and the business can be put back in order. I suppose not, Davies agreed, though it's an untidy ending. Most endings are, Tommy said. People aren't neat and crimes aren't novels. We did what we came here to do. We kept Millicent's friend alive and exposed the threat. The rest will sort itself out. And as the sun rose over Marshwood Manor, painting the old stones gold and driving away the shadows of the night, Tuppence thought that perhaps Tommy was right. They hadn't solved everything perfectly, hadn't prevented every tragedy, but they'd done their best, and in the end, that was all anyone could do. 3 weeks later, Tommy and Tuppence sat in their own drawing room, a fire crackling cheerfully in the grate, and tea things arranged on the table between them. The Morning Post had brought a letter from Millicent, and Tuppence was reading it aloud, while Tommy pretended to do the crossword, but was actually listening intently. Dear Tuppence and Tommy, she read, I hope this letter finds you both recovered from your ordeal. I confess I still have nightmares about that awful weekend, though Dr. Lavington assures me that's perfectly normal after such trauma. Sensible man, Tommy murmured. Charles is recovering well, Tuppence continued. His heart has actually improved since Stein's death. It seems the stress of that partnership was worse for him than anyone realized. The audit of the business has revealed the full extent of Stein's embezzlement. Nearly £50,000 over 10 years. The authorities are working to recover what they can. But Charles says it's more important that the truth is out than that he gets every penny back. He can afford to be philosophical, Tommy said. He's still a wealthy man. Hush. Rose has been staying with us, and I must say, she's rather wonderful. Geoffrey was suspicious of her at first, but even he's come around. They've been getting to know each other as siblings, and I think it's been good for both of them. Geoffrey has agreed to undergo treatment for his gambling problem. Rose actually suggested it in a remarkably diplomatic way, and Charles has put him on a strict allowance until he proves himself responsible. It's a start. Will wonders never cease, Tommy said. Beatrice has returned to London, Tuppence read. I won't pretend we parted as friends, but there was a sort of understanding between us at the end. She's a woman who's lost her son, and I have some sympathy for that, despite everything Harold did. She's speaking to a solicitor about her own finances. Apparently, she wasn't lying about her difficulties, and Charles has agreed to help her, as he should have years ago. Generous of him, Tommy observed. As for me, I find myself remarkably content. Charles has made his will official. Everything is to be divided fairly between Geoffrey and Rose, with provisions for me, of course. The business is being restructured, and a new partner brought in to replace Stein. The house feels lighter somehow, as if a shadow has been lifted. Tuppence looked up from the letter. She concludes with thanks, of course, and an open invitation to visit whenever we like. She signs it, your grateful friend Millicent. Nice to be appreciated, Tommy said, though I could do without the near-death experience next time. There won't be a next time, Tuppence said firmly. We're retired from investigation, remember? This was just a favour for a friend. Of course, Tommy agreed, in the tone of a man who'd heard this promise before and had no faith in its lasting power. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both thinking about Marshwood Manor, about the secrets it had held and the lives it had claimed. Clara Morton dead because she'd tried to do the right thing. Harold Beatrice destroyed by greed and poor choices. And Stain, who'd killed at least twice and might have killed more if they hadn't stopped him. "Do you think we missed anything?" Tuppence asked suddenly. "Something we should have noticed sooner." Tommy considered. "We probably should have realized Harold was involved earlier. The way he questioned you about Millicent's past. He was too well informed for someone who was supposedly innocent. And I should have paid more attention to the secret passages. If we'd known about them from the start, we might have realized how Stein was moving around the house unseen." "True. But Tuppence, we can't solve every mystery perfectly. We're not omniscient, and criminals don't helpfully lay out all their plans for us to discover." "I suppose not." Tuppence poured more tea, a smile playing at her lips. "Though we did rather well, didn't we? Exposed an embezzler, prevented multiple murders, and reunited a family. Not bad for a weekend in the country." "Not bad at all," Tommy agreed, "though I maintain that weekend in the country is a dangerous phrase in our vocabulary. It never means what it's supposed to mean." "No," Tuppence said, her smile widening. "It never does." The fire crackled, the tea cooled, and outside the November afternoon faded toward evening. In a few minutes, Tommy would ask what they were having for dinner, and Tuppence would complain about having to make decisions when she was still recovering from their adventure. They'd bicker mildly and affectionately, decide on something simple, and spend the evening reading or listening to the wireless. It was all delightfully, wonderfully ordinary, and after Marshwood Manor, ordinariness was exactly what they needed. But as Tuppence looked at Tommy over the rim of her teacup, she saw the familiar glint of interest in his eyes that matched the feeling in her own chest. They'd solved another case, prevented harm, brought justice to the guilty. And despite Tommy's grumbling and Tuppence's promises of retirement, they both knew the truth. If another friend needed help, if another mystery presented itself, if another weekend in the country turned dangerous and strange, well, they'd do it all over again. Because that's what Tommy and Tuppence did. They investigated. They solved puzzles. They protected the innocent and exposed the guilty. And they did it together, which made all the danger worthwhile. "Tommy," Tuppence said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Do you think there really was something in those letters Rose's father sent? Something that Stein was desperate to find?" Tommy looked at her over his newspaper. "Probably business information, evidence of the embezzlement that Stein wanted to destroy. That's what everyone assumed. But Tuppence," she leaned forward, "what if there was something else? What if Charles knew more about Stein than he said? What if—" "Tuppence," Tommy said firmly, "the case is closed. I know, but—" "Closed, finished, solved. We're not reopening it." "Of course not," Tuppence agreed, but her eyes were thoughtful, and Tommy knew that look all too well. Somewhere in England, another mystery was waiting. Another puzzle to solve, another injustice to correct, another adventure to undertake. And when it found them, or when they found it, Tommy and Tuppence Beresford would be ready. But for now, for this moment, they had tea and triumph and each other. And really, what more could any pair of amateur detectives want? The fire crackled its agreement. The November darkness pressed against the windows, and in the warm glow of the drawing room, Tommy and Tuppence smiled at each other with the contentment of a job well done, and the anticipation of whatever might come next. After all, they thought in unison without saying a word. There's always a next time, and they wouldn't have it any other way.